from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
And I think it's one of those things where we can win this thing above board. And I don't want us defying the laws, because I want us to be the stewards of law and order in America and of the Constitution. And so I don't want to do anything that could ruin our reputation, especially yet. I don't think that this is an unwinnable battle if we play by the rules ourselves.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Alex Marlow, editor-in-chief of Breitbart News, two-time New York Times best-selling author, and author of the brand new book, Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. You can also find him hosting The Alex Marlow Show. Alex, thanks so much for joining us.
Scott, it's great to be on with you. I enjoy your show, and we're huge appreciators of Hillsdale, both in my household and at Breitbart News.
Well, we appreciate that very much. The new book is a look and overview at the numerous legal efforts the left has tossed toward Donald Trump, and we'll get to those in a second. You say in the beginning, the preface actually, the left's political strategy is to use the legal system to target their opponents. Is this not just an extension of the left's strategy for perhaps decades previously, meaning the legislating from the bench, instilling, defending unpopular and unwanted policies through the judiciary branch? And this is an extension of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I have the first chapter and the introduction are histories of judicial activism and how it's found its home on the left, and the left has been using it for decades. It's not really a new concept. And I think that less aggressive Democrats have tried it and failed numerous times. Sometimes they've tried and succeeded. But this really is part of their DNA. It's part of their, I think, ideological worldview that winning by any means necessary is the strategy. And if that involves using the law, there's plenty of historical examples of that. FDR had fantasies of packing the court in his image, and others did the same. So this really is, I think, a sister to just generic judicial activism that all of you've learned about in school, and has just got extended and hyped up in a major way once Trump came down that escalator.
All right. This term lawfare, of course, is all over the book, Breaking the Law. And it's one that maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we might not have heard. What's lawfare? How do you define it?
It's a good question. And it's something that all of a sudden we never heard it. And then all of a sudden it was in the culture on a constant basis. And I provide a definition of it in the book, right? It's the use of the legal system against political and cultural adversaries and the weaponization of the legal system for partisan political purposes. I kind of separate it because one of them I think is designed to specifically target one specific person, and the other would be using it to achieve broader political goals. But it really is using the legal system not to call balls and strikes the way we would see it, I think, in our mind's eye, but really more just as a tool for political warfare against a perceived enemy.
Speaking of political warfare, before we get to these 6 cases that broke the law, these cases against Donald Trump, you identify in the introduction that the debasing of the immigration system in the country is perhaps lawfare's greatest triumph to date. How was that carried out? What were the consequences?
Yeah, thank you, because this is important to me as a Los Angelino, someone who grew up in Southern California. One of the things that was so informative to my politics, and I think a lot of people who are some of the biggest stars of the conservative movement today, be it commentators who came out of California, there are so many popular ones, from the Dennis Pragers and Larry Elders and the Ben Shapiros of the world to people like Stephen Miller, one of the most powerful people on the planet, who's a contemporary of mine, Los Angeles. And we watched Southern California get destroyed by illegal immigration. And we were constantly told by the elected leaders, There's no other way. We have to do this. And this wasn't just Democrats. It was also establishment Republicans as well that allowed for this one specific set of laws or immigration laws to not be enforced. And we lived in this for my entire time, my entire childhood into my young adulthood in Los Angeles. And it wasn't until 10, 12 years ago where people started to say, wait a minute, that's not true. You don't need to ignore those sets of laws and only those sets of laws. And it is a big trick. It was a big hoax to try to pad the Democrat voter rolls and also lower the wages of the American working class. And Republicans went along with it. All the Democrats loved it. And it completely destroyed this iconic city that I've called home for a long time. And that really was all based off of manipulating the law for political ends, which is more Democrat voters. And so that to me is the big tell of all the tells that the Democrats are willing to take any means possible, even if it completely cheapens what it means to be an American in all of our laws in the books in order to gain a political advantage.
Alex Marlow with us, his book, Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. And we begin now this march through the 6 cases that broke the law involving Donald Trump. And you begin with the Stormy Daniels case. And there's a pretty prevalent misunderstanding even, Alex, about what this case was about. It's about hush money, right? That's what we were, hush money, right?
Yeah, it's again, you're right on the money with these, because I feel like whenever I talk about the case, when I've written about the case, I always feel like I got to make the case. I got to make the point, people, it's not hush money. It was hush money is not illegal, first of all, and you can pay hush money to someone, and it does not guarantee that that person is guilty of anything. And there are examples that I cite in the book of Donald Trump paying hush money, so to speak, of people who clearly have no evidence and have no basis to accuse Trump of anything. He just is avoiding scandal for himself because he's a rich and powerful guy. He's busy. Mm-hmm. How much time is he supposed to spend dealing with hangers-on, trying to extract some attention or money from him? So he's been known to use a catch and kill strategy where you try to buy stories and then you sit on them. And in this case, the Stormy Daniels case, it was technically about falsifying business records that Trump had amassed payments to Stormy Daniels that were not hush money as a campaign funds that were masked as something else. And all of this is very convoluted. It's an incredibly weak case. Where I go through all the details in the book on how weak the case was. It feels completely absurd at certain moments. And the convictions were due to the fact that it was a New York judge and jury and a very highly motivated, highly ambitious Manhattan district attorney, Alvin Bragg. And this case was deeply supported from deep inside the Joe Biden White House. And that was how the conviction was achieved. It was not because Trump had actually, the evidence was clear that he had done anything so improper.
E. Jean Carroll is the case that is discussed next. And I love you mentioned the, I guess, somewhat little-known nugget. She was a one-time, short-time writer for Saturday Night Live back in the 80s as well. But you called this case and these allegations the purest lawfare example in the book. Why is that?
Because this case reads as completely absurd. Now, Carroll has sued Trump successfully for defamation, so I need to be very careful with my words here on this. But when you read the facts of the case and you map them out end to end, I would be very surprised people pick up the book and read the first few pages if they don't find themselves actually laughing at the absurdity of what this woman has concocted against Donald Trump. And the fact that she is considered trustworthy, though she had no witnesses, she told no one at the time that she was allegedly sexually assaulted by President Trump. She's a known fabulous. She's someone who creates fictions. She is obsessed with sex at Bergdorf Goodman. She has talked about it periodically throughout her career, and yet she claims that's what Donald Trump forced her to engage in. She could not decide whether or not Trump had raped her or not. She could not settle on that word choice. And she went back and forth, initially stating it was not rape, that it was a fight, whatever that means. And then later on saying, okay, it was rape. She'd preserved this dress that she'd been wearing at the night of the encounter, but then wouldn't turn it over so that they could get DNA evidence from Donald Trump off of it. it just reads completely farcical end to end. And yet she got multiple judgments against Trump from those New York courts for what I believe were cruel and unusual punishments that far exceeded even the numbers that she was asking. She asked for, a few million. She ended up getting judgments for close to $100 million. Totally insane case and the most absurd in the book. And that's why I say it's the purest example of lawfare, because it barely even had a kernel of a place to start.
Alex Marlow with us. Breaking the Law is his book, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. One of the great things about Breaking the Law is for those readers who might not have been exactly locked in on these cases, it provides great delineations between which case was which one was Tish James. Oh, that was the estimated worth of Mar-a-Lago, right? Which one was Fannie Willis? Oh, that's the Georgia case. So the Fannie Willis case is the Georgia case, the allegation that Donald Trump was find me the votes to overturn the results of the election. This is, if I'm not mistaken, the only criminal case against Donald Trump among these six, correct?
So technically there's four criminal cases. The E. Jean Carroll case is a civil case, and the Tish James case as well. The Mershon Bragg case with Stormy Daniels, a criminal case. The two Jack Smith cases that I go through in detail were criminal. And the Fannie Willis case also was a criminal case using a RICO statute to try to get Trump on that. That one fizzled out pretty quick. So these are really reasonable questions. And I write the book for someone who is not locked in. In fact, my details, it took me really the first several months of research was me straightening all of them out in my head. And this is part of the lawfare strategy. It's very important to discuss this because I try to take them on one at a time as much as I can in terms of a narrative structure so that people who have not lived and died with these cases can get into the cases.
Yes.
But I think what's so important here, Scott, is that Donald Trump was dealing with them all at once while he was running for president. He's running for president. He's trying to save his businesses. He's trying to save face on a personal level. His family is getting wrapped up into some of these cases. He's trying to take back the White House. And in the meantime, he has to sort out 6 cases at a time with various legal teams that are clearly orchestrated and connected and designed to keep him out of the White House and to ideally put him in a jailhouse. And that is why I felt like this book was fundamental and necessary to write, because I don't think anyone has really contextualized it in that way to this point.
The Willis case, you make a point to argue she made a big mistake by involving a guy named Mike Roman in this case. What was his role?
Yeah, thank you. I love Mike Roman. Mike Roman he's a strategist. He's a researcher. He's someone who has been one of my top informants and tipsters at Breitbart for a decade and a half. And he's one of those guys, I liken him to the Wolf in Pulp Fiction, where he's the guy who he just knows how to get things done. It's not always glamorous. You don't always get you're not always going to get the top headline on it, but this is a guy who is a truly true just character and someone who you just do not want to be on the wrong side of him. And what ended up happening in this case, that they were trying to prove that Trump was running a racketeering conspiracy in Georgia to try to rig the election. It wasn't just that Trump was upset about the results, it's that he was really running a criminal enterprise. And so they had to charge all these other people who maybe didn't do anything or maybe were just, Republican delegates, things like that. And one of the guys who got caught in the dragnet is a guy named Mike Roman, which is a very, very dumb move because if you go after Mike Roman, you better be clean as a whistle. You better not have an unpaid parking ticket because he is the type of guy that is going to find it out and he's going to air it. And we learned very quickly, thanks to Roman, that Fannie had nothing of the sort. She hired her boyfriend, who was she hired her boyfriend onto this case, who was a guy named Nathan Wade, who was a divorce attorney. He was a family lawyer. He had no background in RICO whatsoever. He had no education in it. He had no trial law experience. She puts him on the case, and all of a sudden, the two of them on the taxpayer dime are jet setting. They're going to wine tastings. They're going to the Caribbean. They're going on one vacation after the next, all off of taxpayer money. Roman figures this out right away and says, wait a minute, why is this guy who has no business doing RICO law on this case And there's evidence he's going on all these trips with Fani Willis, and he realized they're having an illicit relationship, which was, largely undisclosed. Nathan Wade was married at the time. He ends up getting divorced. One other detail I point out in the book, Wade is 2 8-hour meetings in the White House. Why would a nobody family lawyer who no one's ever heard of get 2 8-hour meetings with White House attorneys? There's only one explanation for that, and that's they were coordinating illegally with the Joe Biden White House during this case. All of this information is because Fani Willis made the mistake of indicting Mike Roman. And going after Mike Roman means everything about you is going to come out, and it did.
Alex Marlow with us from Breitbart News, editor-in-chief there. His book, Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. Now we get to the Jack Smith cases. You say the classified document case, that was the most dangerous for Donald Trump on its merits. What was the difference?
Yeah, the difference with this one is that you could see on a technical level, on a literal level, that this is something that was perhaps illegal, that Trump had these documents. He could have declassified them at any point. There was no evidence that he was, flaunting national security secrets to people. There's no evidence he was selling them or anything like that. But theoretically, you're supposed to go through some sort of a process with National Archives to declassify documents that you want to take with you. Every president has done this, and Trump could have done this at any point. And there's even a moment where Trump acknowledged verbally that he could have declassified them, implying that perhaps he was aware or had become aware that he hadn't handled things totally above board, legally speaking, in this case. So is this the greatest offense of all time? Is this Watergate? No, of course not. But it was something that you could see a legal rationale where he could get busted here. That said, there is a huge hypocrisy angle here, is that I cite example after example in the book of people with much more egregious documents violations, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, CIA directors, one after the next, Mike Pence, even people who never had the ability to declassify documents. Like Joe Biden had documents illegally from his Senate days that he was keeping in a warehouse garage with a classic car that Hunter Biden had access to. Donald Trump did nothing like that, but theoretically they could have busted him on just the literal that he had the documents and he should have declassified them. So that case did make me very nervous. But the good news is that Trump's legal team had their most ingenious move of any of the cases that I investigated in this book, which is they were able to ascertain that Jack Smith's entire existence was unconstitutional, right? That he was not moored by any sort of regulation or oversight, rendering him entirely illegal. Typically, these types of special counsels are led up by the types of attorneys that are confined to a specific jurisdiction. There's limitations on their power. You can't just wave your wand and say a guy like Jack Smith has the full power of the federal government to get every document possible, to subpoena everyone, to harass everyone. And that's exactly what the Biden DOJ attempted to do. And it took a year and a half to figure this out, but eventually the Trump attorneys were able to do so. And that's why Eileen Cannon was able to throw out the entire case.
That's Alex Marlow, editor-in-chief of Breitbart News. His new book, Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. We'll continue with Alex in just a moment, but first I want to make sure you're aware of what's happening on the Hillsdale Dialogues. Hugh Hewitt and Matt Spaulding, Vice President of Washington Operations and Dean of Hillsdale in D.C.'s Van Andel Graduate School of Government, are having an ongoing conversation about the road to the American Revolution. The newest episode is up right now at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Search for Hillsdale Dialogues. This week, they talk about the interesting parallels between the lives of President George Washington and President Donald Trump. Also, the early campaigns of the Continental Army and the Battle of Bunker Hill. Listen to Hugh Hewitt and Dr. Matthew Spaulding talk about the road to the American Revolution right now on Hillsdale Dialogues. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio, including YouTube. We continue now with Alex Marlow, editor-in-chief of Breitbart News. His brand new book, Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. Alex, Before we get to some of the conclusions and recommendations in breaking the law, you point out a couple of times, I think even mentioned in our conversation, people weren't locked in to these cases necessarily. And when they did, many times they sort of sided with Donald Trump, saying maybe the threat to democracy is the fact that this lawfare is happening. I do wonder, do you think that Donald Trump wins in 2024 without these lawsuits being filed? Did they completely backfire on Democrats?
I think it did completely backfire. And I think that he's got a shot if he just does his typical. I think regular Trump is still great. As editor of Breitbart, I've been a fan of President Trump since the very, very early days of his political career. I think that he latches on to very popular issues. And I like that he takes the media to task on a constant basis. I like that he reset global trade and that he wants a secure border. I think his foreign policy has been A+. So I have faith that he could have won, particularly with the two terrible candidates the Democrats had. But that said, when you've got Jack Smith organizing, or I guess this was pre-Jack Smith, but if you got the Biden FBI and DOJ allowing for a midnight raid or an early morning raid on Melania Trump's underwear drawer, where they're sorting through it, looking for state secrets. I had a feeling once they started doing stuff like that, Trump was going to win. And it's just because the American people, that does not set well with them. And they're aware that that is not equal justice under the law. And I do think as a society, though deeply partisan Democrats are willing to suspend that notion, I think in a vacuum, most Americans do want equal protection under the law. And it was clear that Donald Trump was not being afforded that during the scope of these trials. So I do think it was a huge political benefit for Trump and ultimately did guarantee his victory. But that was provided he was not in jail or completely disqualified, which was the attempt.
Breaking the Law is the book. Alex Marlow is the author. You run down the tactics, the superstructure, some of the things that these lawfare cases have in common: a novel interpretation of the law, coordination across the democratic ecosystem. You get down to one involving ProPublica, which I was very interested by, because people might know ProPublica is where Democrats go to sort of launder stories to make them seem credible. This is where IRS tax returns get leaked and published. This is where stories about Justice Thomas, Justice Alito go.
Yes.
And you describe this in a very good way in Breaking the Law. How should people view stories from ProPublica?
Yeah, thank you. This is you're keying in a lot of stuff I'm passionate about. I've written about ProPublica a long time because as a newsman, first, ProPublica's information is generally accurate. And when I read something from ProPublica, I can generally believe what I'm reading. But they are designed to weaponize stories against conservatives to damage them politically. And that is their mission. It's a nonprofit. It's largely funded by a group called the Sandler Foundation, which was founded by a multi-billionaire magnate named Herb Sandler. But it's funded also by a lot of your murderer's row of Democrat funders. George Soros, Laurene Powell Jobs, who's the Apple and Pixar heir, who I've written about in all of my books and is deeply connected in Biden and Kamala Harris world. All of them are big donors to ProPublica. And what they do is they take things like they'll find a little kernel of that, Clarence Thomas took a vacation with a rich guy, and they will treat it as though this means that he's completely compromised on all of his on all of his decisions coming from the bench. Now, there's no evidence that Clarence Thomas altered one single decision because he's got a wealthy friend he vacations with, but yet they will create that specter, and they have millions of dollars in budget to do that. And they do it with this veneer of solid journalism that makes it seem very glossy and very serious, but ultimately it's just weaponized news, often fake news, occasionally real news, to try to score political points. And they are a true villain in this because they're the ones who have tried to ruin the lives of Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, who are the two standard bearers for judicial conservatism and originalism.
You discuss what you call the new existential threat. Part of this is these injunctions that have been so popular since Donald Trump took office a second time, including in the most recent Planned Parenthood case, where a judge is saying the Congress must spend money. They specifically said, we don't want to spend. We don't want to fund Planned Parenthood. You say that things like this, the judiciary's unmitigated assault on the executive branch will continue until the system changes. Part of that is dismantling that superstructure you mentioned before, but you also talk about ending judge shopping, ending forum shopping for these cases. How does that get accomplished?
Yeah, that's a tough one because a lot of the laws on the books make it so that it's fairly easy for people to try to find a jurisdiction that's favorable for them to get a specific outcome. And there's a way to randomize it to try to keep this to an absolute minimum. But the best way to neutralize ourselves, we in the conservative movement about this, is to just win elections all the time. Mm-hmm. And the more conservatives who win, the more conservative judges who win in elections, and the more conservatives who win on a national basis, the more appointments that take place, where people will treat law and order as just that, law and order. They're not going to treat it as a mechanism to achieve some sort of political outcomes. I do have some specific recommendations in terms of what can be done to end judge shopping and forum shopping, where you can basically know the outcome of a case before once the jury and the judge are assigned, you know exactly how it's going to go. We need to keep this to an absolute minimum in this country. Now, I'll tell you, conservatives still use it as well. So it's not like there's a two-edged sword to this thing, that savvy conservatives will try to file cases in the correct districts. But you'll notice, particularly in the section of the book where I go through some of this recent round of district judges who are upending parts of the agenda, they tend to come from the same courts, the same circuits, the same areas in the country. And savvy, the superstructures, I call it, which is the massive legal apparatus of Democrats worth billions of dollars and very focused, very well-funded, very smart people. They know where to file these cases if they can do it. And they do that, and it almost guarantees an outcome, and that slows everything down.
The next Supreme Court opening, you have some suggestions for Donald Trump. Senator Lee, Senator Cruz, Senator Hawley are three names you mentioned. Why perhaps go through the Senate and not a current judge somewhere?
Scott, you got a great eye. This is another one that it's a little Easter egg for people paying close attention in this one. My recommendation is that we've just been disappointed with some of the selections that have come from the conservative legal world. And I feel like Trump made three good picks during his first administration. I think with narrow majorities in the Senate, it was hard to make better picks. I do take some issue with some of Amy Coney Barrett's decisions so far, but that's a longer topic for a different conversation. But I was trying to think, what is a way to guarantee that there's no drama, that you just have pure strict constructionists, originalists who are brilliant, like Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas? How do we get people like that? And the conclusion that I've drawn is what I'm looking for is longevity in the conservative movement. Now, you need to have the requisite resume items. You got to be an attorney. You got to do the Supreme Court clerkship. But once you've done those things, what I want to see is that you've put your life on the line, so to speak, to fight for these values, to fight for conservative values. I want to see that tested. And so when you see people like a Ted Cruz or a Mike Lee, both of whom are young enough to be in the Supreme Court for a couple of decades at least, you're looking at people who have sacrificed in order to try to advance the cause of conservatism in the United States of America. And given that they've got those qualifications on the resume that I think make them qualified, that's where I would start, because we know if those guys were on the bench, we would depend on the best possible decisions. They'd also be well written because they're both brilliant guys. And I think that that's the outside the box approach Trump should take if he gets more picks.
Alex Marlow's book is Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. One final question. A lot of do's in this last section of the book to try to fight back. There is one big don't. You say don't defy orders of district judges if you are President Trump and the administration. Why is that an important line to draw?
You know, maybe I'm an optimist about this. At heart, I always find that I run a little bit optimistic. I've got a bunch of young children. You don't have young children if you don't have an optimistic streak. But I think we can win legit. I don't think we have to break the rules to win. I think that it's slower, but we've seen this. I cite examples early in the book about how sometimes a slow, methodical approach can actually work. We can change hearts and minds over time. We can win enough elections over time to remake the court. The Supreme Court was incredibly liberal 50, 60 years ago, and now it's a solid conservative court with a chance to get even more conservative. And I think it's one of those things where we can win this thing above board, and I don't want us defying the laws because I want us to be the stewards of law and order in America and of the Constitution. And so I don't want to do anything that would that could ruin our reputation, especially yet. I don't think that this is an unwinnable battle if we play by the rules ourselves.
Alex Marlow is editor-in-chief at Breitbart News. He's host of The Alex Marlow Show. Find him on X at Alex Marlow, and his brand new book is out now, Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump. Alex, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Scott, thanks to you and to Hillsdale.
Up next, we talk with Dr. Eric Hutchinson from Hillsdale's Classics Department. He has an introduction to the Aeneid. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hello, this is Jeremiah Regan, and I have some great news. We've brought Hillsdale's incredibly popular free online courses to the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. The Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast brings you our online courses in their entirety, with courses ranging from ancient history and biblical epics to foundational political principles and the future of American citizenship. Follow the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast to hear new episodes every week with additional commentary and insights from our team. Go to podcast.hillsdale.edu to learn more. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu or find our episodes anywhere you get your audio, including YouTube. We're joined by Dr. Eric Hutchinson. He is Associate Professor of Classics and Chairman of the Collegiate Scholars Program at Hillsdale College. Dr. Hutchinson, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Talking today about an introduction to the Aeneid. And if I'm not mistaken, you spend an entire course on an introduction to the Aeneid.
Yeah, we often do. It's a Latin course,
yes.
Where we read selections from a variety of books of the Aeneid. Yes.
So we'll try to do some of that in a shorter amount of time today. Begin by asking, what is the Aeneid? Who wrote it? What should we know about it?
One of the most famous papers on the Aeneid opens with the following sentence. The Aeneid is a literary epic. It refers to a literary tradition and was intended for a literary audience. So the Aeneid is an epic poem in a specifically literary and self-consciously literary mode and that's intended to distinguish it from something like the Homeric epics, where the Aeneid is written as a piece of or a development of a literary tradition that already exists, whose readers will be familiar with that preceding literary tradition. Homer, but not just Homer, other writers of epic as well. And so the poem is attempting to basically to create a place for itself as the rightful heir of the entire epic literary tradition that comes before it. The Aeneid was written by a Roman named Publius Virgilius Maro, and we normally just refer to him as Virgil. He was born in 70 BC and died in 19 BC. The Aeneid was the last of Virgil's three major works. And arguably the most important and the most influential in subsequent centuries. So the Aeneid is an epic poem in 12 books in the tradition of the poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Who's the protagonist of the Aeneid, and what's his mission? What's the plot here? The
protagonist of the Aeneid is Aeneas, who is a survivor from the Trojan War. So the Aeneid has its sort of historical or pseudo-historical place as the sequel to the events that are narrated in Homer's Iliad and its aftermath. So after the Greeks are finally victorious in the Trojan War, after their decade-long siege of the city of Troy in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, Aeneas escapes with a small group of people. And he is now, like the Blues Brothers, a man on a mission. He is supposed to make his way to the West, although his destination is not is frequently and for a long time unclear to him. He doesn't know exactly where he's supposed to be going. It's only given to him in bits and pieces. But he is supposed to, and we the readers know that he is supposed to make his way to Italy, where he will establish a new people that will eventually become the Romans, will found the city of Rome and the Roman Empire, and after that will conquer the world. And so that's what he is supposed to do. So he's first half of the poem, he's on this incredible journey, and the second half of the poem, he has arrived in Italy, and lo and behold, there are people there already. And so if he is going to be able to get territory for himself and continue his line, he needs a land, he needs a wife because his former wife had died in the sack of Troy, and the girl for him is already betrothed to someone else who lives there. So now we have to have another war. So the first thing that Aeneas does once he gets to Italy is to have to sort of start the whole war thing over again. So the second half of the poem is war, and the poem ends with the death of Turnus, the victory of Aeneas and his men and their allies, and things then go on from there. In the aftermath of the poem, that's not narrated in the poem itself.
What do we learn about Aeneas along the way? What are his defining characteristics, and how does he compare to other heroes from these epics?
Aeneas is most well known for his pietas, for his. This is a word that's often just transliterated as piety, which is okay as long as we know what that means. Pietas does not mean just having a really sincere attitude about, religious or moral stuff or something. Pietas is best summed up with the idea of dutifulness, of fulfilling one's duties, and a Roman would have thought of that at sort of three levels: one's duties to his gods, his country or his people, and his family. And so the chief characteristic of Aeneas is his pietas. He's often referred to as Pius Aeneas, Pius Aeneas, because of the way in which he pursues the fulfillment of his duties. The best picture of this is when he is leaving from Troy in flames, and he's carrying his household gods, and he's got his young son that he's leading by the hand and carrying his father on his back as he goes out. It's also a famous sculpture by Bernini of this image, and that's where you can sort of see encapsulated this idea of pietas. However, piety is not the only characteristic of Aeneas. He's also marked by a kind of remarkable ignorance in the poem, which is to say he often doesn't know where he's going or how to get there. There are a series of divine interventions, prophecies, oracles that keep pointing him or trying to point him in the right direction. His ignorance of what he is doing. This is one of the things. This is how I think I would connect that to your question about how he compares to other sorts of heroes, and let's take Homeric heroes in particular. Aeneas is not a person who is on a mission for his own sake. Mm-hmm. He is bearing with him the future destiny of this people who will become the Romans, and it's not necessary for him to know everything that will occur. He's given all of these visions of the future, but he doesn't necessarily know what they mean. The best example of this is the shield that is wrought for him by the god Vulcan, that has scenes from Roman history on it, but none of it's happened yet. And so Aeneas looks at it and he's sort of infatuated with the pictures, but he doesn't know what he's seeing. Mm-hmm. And then in this very great and significant symbolic action, he shoulders the shield and carries it into battle. He's carrying all of the future history of Rome into war with him, but he doesn't know what it is, and yet he does it anyway. So the other chief characteristic, we might say, is where we see in a Homeric hero acting spontaneously to gain glory, kleos for himself, gain the objects of his desire, somebody like Achilles, and doing it for his own sake. Aeneas is a hero who is characterized by, C.S. Lewis pointed this out in an essay a long time ago, that he's, I think, really the first hero that we see who has a vocation. So Aeneas has a calling that he must fulfill whether he wishes to or not. And beyond that, whether he even understands it or not. And that's completely different from anything that we see in the Homeric poems.
Talking with Dr. Eric Hutchinson about the Aeneid, an introduction to the Aeneid. So we know about Aeneas. Can you introduce us to some of the secondary characters who play an important role inside the Aeneid?
Yes, I'll do a few of these maybe. The one that listeners might be most familiar with by name is Dido, the Queen of Carthage. In his Confessions, Augustine talks about reading about the death of Dido in the Aeneid and weeping over it, and he regrets this years later because he wasn't weeping over his own sin, he was weeping over and his own death apart from God, but instead was weeping over the death of this woman in a poem. This is how sort of profoundly the character of Dido has affected readers for centuries. Dido, as I said, is the Queen of Carthage. In some ways, she is a sort of doublet of Aeneas himself. She had to flee her homeland and has established a new people with new laws and a new city in North Africa. Aeneas and his men arrive there because they're blown off course. He and Dido fall in love. The short version is she wants him to stay. He says he can't because he has to go to Italy. This is where the gods want him to go. This is where his fate is leading him. And she commits suicide. And so she's this sort of tragic figure in the early part of the poem, who we might say symbolizes the way in which Aeneas, in order to fulfill his vocation, has to subordinate private desires to his public mission. And the corollary of that is, okay, this great glorious thing, the foundation of Rome, has as its flip side, at many points throughout the poem, this massive cost that is borne by a number of figures in the poem. So it's not as though it's all one thing or another. There are these great public achievements, but there are also these terrible personal tragedies that occur along the way. So that's Dido. Another very important secondary figure is his father, Anchises, whom Aeneas brings with him from Troy. He dies on their journey, but then in Book 6, Aeneas goes to the underworld, and Anchises gives him another one of these visions of the future and shows him the sort of parade of Roman heroes who are yet to come, and gives him a statement about what the sort of peculiar duty of the Roman people is. Maybe we'll come back to that in a little bit. The other secondary character who's worth drawing particular attention to, and there are others besides these three, but the other one I'll mention is Turnus. He is a prince in Italy who is betrothed to the woman that Aeneas is told he must marry, and so he's the chief antagonist in the war between Aeneas and his men and the Rutulians. And the poem ends famously with Aeneas killing a disarmed Turnus who is asking him for mercy. So those are a few of the sort of secondary characters that we get in the poem.
How does the Aeneid portray this tension between war and peace?
War and peace in the Aeneid are, in many respects, symbiotic. I think we don't get the one without the other, and peace itself is a result very frequently of war. At the end of Book 6, when Aeneas is speaking with his father Anchises in the underworld, Anchises tells him that his job, and he calls him Roman, which is obviously anachronistic, but he's already looking to the future. he says, remember, Roman, and we could take this as sort of an address just to the Romans as such. Remember, Roman, to rule the peoples with your imperial power, your sway, your imperium. These will be the arts, the skills for you that you have, that the Romans have. And to impose morality or custom upon peace, to spare subject peoples and to war down the proud. So the Romans are to be a conquering people who basically establish peace through warfare and through the expansion of empire. And so the peculiar characteristic of the Romans is to spare those who submit and to wage war upon the proud until they do. That's a line, incidentally, that Bob Dylan quotes in Lonesome Day Blues. This spot from the Aeneid, and so I think we see there that sort of, I don't know, maybe uncomfortable joining of war and peace together. I mean, so it's peace, but on Roman terms and under Roman authority. And making this even more complicated, incidentally, is okay, so this is what Aeneas is told that the Romans are supposed to do: spare the defeated, right? Spare those who are subject. But at the end of the poem, Turnus is defeated and is on his knees in front of Aeneas, and Aeneas does the opposite of this. So there are. This is one of the many ways in which Virgil sort of complicates the themes of his poem.
Talking with Dr. Eric Hutchinson from our classics department here at Hillsdale College about the Aeneid, giving you an introduction to the Aeneid. You've referenced this a couple of times. Do we want to say anything more about the concept of fate and how that is shaping the actions and destinies of characters here?
I mean, I think there's a lot that we could say about it. I'll just say this. There is this thing called fate that is referred to in the poem that seems to sit beyond or behind even Jupiter himself. Even Jupiter is subject to these sort of decrees of the fates. And so what's going to happen is going to happen in the sense that Rome will be founded. However, fate in the Aeneid does not mean that every detail, every small action is predetermined such that the characters are not making choices or something like that. We see this particularly through the antagonism of Juno, who attempts to thwart Aeneas from his course and keep him from Italy. Even though that pursuit is ultimately futile, and she is aware of this, there's a lot that she can do to make things very unpleasant for Aeneas and his men along the way. So we might say that the ends are fixed, or certain kinds of ends are fixed, but that there is still, a decent amount of wiggle room in the interim or in the means to get to those ends. So the end is never in doubt, which is to say the end of Aeneas establishing his people on the Italian peninsula. And that will be accomplished, whatever mistakes he happens to make along the way. That still is going to occur. However, there are ways in which that can go along more easily or less easily. That fate seems to leave somewhat open.
Dr. Eric Hutchinson is Associate Professor of Classics and Chairman of the Collegiate Scholars Program here at Hillsdale College as we bring you an introduction to the Aeneid. Dr. Hutchinson, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you for having me on.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Alex Marlow, author of Breaking the Law, Exposing the Weaponization of America's Legal System Against Donald Trump, and Dr. Eric Hutchinson from Hillsdale's Classics Department. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.